Welcome back, boils and ghouls. Have no fear, you're not lost, you're just off the beaten rack. Last week we talked about the first 10 issues of Treehouse of Horror, the dramatic artistic shift that was taking place, and of course, some of the absolutely ridiculous names involved with this series. This week we're going to be putting what I personally consider to be the single best comic that Bongo ever released under a microscope, with names from previous issues including everyone from Paul Dini and Michael Allred to Sergio Aragones and Jeff Darrow, Phil Noto to Stan Sakai, Garth Ennis to Dan DiCarlo, Jeff Smith, and even Evan Dorkin. I can safely say you ain't seen nothing yet. Issue 11 of Treehouse of Horror is so ridiculously jam-packed with some of the greatest names to ever work in the medium. It is an absolute crime that more people don't know about this series, and this issue in particular. And if you're not irked by this right now, just wait until the end of this video and you find out some of the absolutely ridiculous people Bill Morrison managed to land for this issue. But that's enough of an intro. Kick back and relax for another tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia and a little video essay I like to call Bart Simpson's Hidden Treehouse of Horrors. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, hit that like button, think about sharing these videos with your friends, and if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page, make donations via Ko-Fi, use the join button right here on YouTube to sign up for membership, or pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the one you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. Issue 11 is the last stop on our journey through this labyrinth of hidden Simpsons history. It feels like this was the issue that they were kind of unknowingly working towards from day one, and that everything preceding and in many ways following this one were just kind of mad science experiments to see who they could get involved with an issue of a Simpsons comic. I'll say this, if you read just one issue of this entire series, this should be it. That is not a knock on any of the other issues. I highly recommend picking up this entire series. It's just issue 11 feels not only like the best issue of Treehouse of Horror, but the penultimate Bongo publication in a lot of ways. Issue 11 is a special and unique case in a lot of ways, even when compared to the already aberrantly interesting Treehouse of Horror title, which at best vestigially resembled Bongo's other books. This issue would prove to be so difficult and labor intensive, I'm pretty sure they were already working on trying to get it together during the publication of the previous issue. This is why issue 10 feels so phoned in my opinion. While I was never able to find a direct quote to support this, I do know that issue 11 was the first issue Bill Morrison began to wonder if his concept for the issue was even possible. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew who he wanted involved, but even if the people he sought out agreed to do the work, Morrison began to wonder if he could actually manage to pull off one of the greatest modern assemblies of talent that I have ever seen on a single title. If it was, though, it was going to take a lot of work to pull off, and Morrison, never one to turn down a challenge, attacked things as pragmatically as possible, seemingly prepared for every eventuality that he might be confronted with. The original idea was to recruit all these writers and artists who had worked on the actual 1950s EC titles, which had inspired the Simpsons creators to come up with the Treehouse of Horror television episodes, which had then in turn, of course, spawned the comic title to begin with. Unfortunately, by 2007, most of the original EC artists were no longer alive, and those that were simply wouldn't or couldn't do commercial work anymore, especially not a full-length story for a Simpsons comic. During a 2015 interview, Morrison revealed that while the end goal was to get all these EC horror guys, he didn't know if they could actually do it for a myriad of reasons. As a result, Morrison had been forced to come up with a backup plan of sorts, which he was then forced to pursue simultaneously while attempting to secure the EC talent he originally had in mind as well. While the Simpsons creator, and obviously Bill Morrison as well, loved the old EC books and were hoping to center an issue around that talent, Morrison himself had grown up on the post-code Marvel and DC horror titles of the 1970s. Morrison was much more familiar with, and truth be told, probably a bigger fan of those post-code horror titles like Tomb of Dracula, House of Secrets, and Swamp Thing than shocking suspense stories or weird science. With little assurance that the EC angle would actually pan out, Bill Morrison decided to reach out to a few of the more famous teams of writers and artists which had contributed to those post-code Marvel and DC horror books, many of whom were still active in the industry at this point in 2006. Well, this essentially translated to twice the work for Morrison, as he was basically working on 2 issues simultaneously, and the added promise of only one of them ever seeing the light of day, even if he managed to get everyone he asked to do the book involved. Something weird and kind of magical happened. In fact, every single person that Bill Morrison had managed to track down and ask to work on the book agreed to do it. And I'm not just talking about the Marvel and DC folks either. Everyone that they managed to track down, including the EC alumni, many of whom were either retired or physically incapable of doing stories to the point that they were turning down work from the big guns like Marvel and DC, were eager to work on the title as well. Morrison was floored. He'd never dreamed that half of these guys would agree to work on a Simpsons comic for what had to be peanuts compared to what they could make on commissions and stuff. While this was good news for fans, and obviously pretty cool for Morrison as well, it left him in sort of a quagmire. Did he go with his initial concept of an EC-centric driven issue and pray that the Marvel and DC post-code guys would work on a later issue, or indeed even still be working at all in a year or two's time? Did he pick the best teams from everyone who had agreed and snub some of the most legendary names to ever grace comics by telling them they didn't have room for the story he'd asked them to do? It seemed an impossible choice, and in another bold move, rather than make a judgment call on who is going to make the cut or even which version of the comic they were going to go with, Morrison just hired everyone and endeavored to make it work. At this point, I don't think Morrison really cared what it took. He just knew that this was it. This was the one that they had been waiting for, the one they had been working for since the series started, and he wasn't going to let it fall apart because of something silly like page count limitations. While I'm not usually a fan, to put it lightly, which is to say I abhor them, the concept of one side or half of the comic being dedicated to pre-code horror and the other post-code horror actually not only manages to make the usage of the flip book interesting, but almost logical in this case. I'm loath to admit it, but Bongo absolutely killed it with this gimmick. It was literally a stroke of genius. Rather than some annoying novelty trick or sales ploy, being a flip book instead allowed Bongo to create entirely separate layouts and aesthetic design choices, as well as 2 unique covers for each era without having to compromise, blend, or even choose between the two. And this is a good thing, because as usual, Morrison and Bongo had done their homework and tailored this issue to fit the talent extremely well. The EC side of the book is split into 5 short stories, around 5 pages apiece. Many of EC's most seminal stories were 5 to 6 pages long, so it wasn't like Morrison was cutting anyone off, although traditionally stories would have varied in length much more than they do in issue 11 of Treehouse of Horror in any given EC comic. But this would intimate that Morrison was trying to emulate or mimic an EC comic, and I don't think that was the case. I conversely don't think he was trying to ape Marvel or DC horror titles either. In the end, it seems Morrison was like a kid in a candy store. He was surrounded by some of the names and faces he'd grown up worshipping, and he was bound and determined to get every single one of them to do work for the book. In the end, it really feels like this book was simply about covering as much ground and paying as much homage as possible along the way and looking really cool while doing it. Long gone were the days of concerns for artistic liberties or shying away from stories over subject matter, and Bill Morrison was going to make the most of it, come hell or high water. The opening tale, 2 Tickets to Heck, is deftly co-written by Chris Bonham, who never worked on more than a handful of other stories for Bongo, or in fact, any publisher that I'm aware of, though I can only assume that he was a Bongo staffer for at least a period of time. Apparently, Itchy and Scratchy Land gets this makeover as a Halloween-themed park for the season, and of course, the Simpsons find themselves there. There's this weird gag where they get different letter tickets for the different levels of ride. Of course, Lisa and Bart end up with the E and C tickets and discover that by combining them, they get access to a very special attraction: the Creepy Crypt of Horror Hotel. It's a fun, if a little overly contrived, way of paying direct homage to EC, and also a rather clever way of tying all the stories together into one overarching narrative. The co-author of Two Tickets to Heck is a man named Steve Ringenberg. Unlike Bonham, Steve Ringenberg was a name that I definitely had seen before, and something of an EC aficionado as well. While his work in the comics field itself is rather limited, at least insofar as stories and issues go, Ringenberg actually had several interviews with original EC staffers published starting in the late 1970s and early 80s. Ringenberg might not be a prolific comic book creator, but he is a prolific interviewer. He's worked with and for a host of different publications over the years and done interviews with everyone from Gil Kane and Frank Miller to Frank Frazetta and Harvey Kurtzman in the process. According to his bio, Ringenberg has done more than 200 interviews during his 30-plus years as a freelance writer. Several of Ringenberg's other limited credits in the pages of published comic books just so happen to be for the Russ Cochran EC title reprints, which I grew up reading a lot as a kid. Having had interviews with EC legends and heavy hitters like Al Feldstein, John Severin, and Al Williamson published in Cochran's 1980s EC reprints, this means that Steve Ringenberg had access and contact information for the old EC alumni. In addition to the above-mentioned interviews with EC writers and artists, Ringenberg had also conducted a number of interviews with EC staffers for other publications, including William Gaines himself in 1991 for Gauntlet magazine. If you're unfamiliar with Russ Cochran's name, then it is suffice to say that aside from William Gaines, there probably wasn't anyone else with this kind of access and appreciation for EC Comics on the face of the earth. Russ Cochran is the man responsible for basically reprinting and safeguarding the entire EC Comics legacy and was a trailblazing individual in many regards. If you want to learn more, I'll make sure to stick a link in the description so you can check out the embarrassingly old real-life EC Vault of Horror episode, and if you want to learn more after that, please get in the comment section because I would love to do an episode about Russ and his work. The long and short of it is, Ringenberg was an interviewer who had worked directly with and for Russ Cochran. Russ Cochran was directly involved with and intrinsically tied to William Gaines, the guy who actually put out the EC horror titles that they were aping, and this put Ringenberg in a rather unique position and means that there would be few other people with this level of access to the old EC roster on a professional and personal level. This all indicates to me that Steve Ringenberg was likely the reason that Morrison was able to secure every single one of the EC artists that he managed to track down and approach. I don't know this for sure, but there's no other explanation that I can find for why Ringenberg would be included in this issue otherwise, or how Bongo managed to convince some of these guys to do a story for them. Unless, of course, it was with the help of Angelo Torres. Angelo Torres most certainly should have had even more access to the EC collective, but the only reason I can even surmise that Bongo or Morrison would have known to track down Angelo Torres or who he was in regards to EC, honestly, was if Ringenberg had told him. Angelo Torres, who provides this second story in the EC half of the issue, A Quick Way to a Crusty Death, is nothing short of a mainstay in horror comics, although most people are probably way more familiar with his name due to his lengthy stay as a Mad Magazine alumni, contributing hundreds of parody works for the magazine between 1969 and 2005. While he's certainly best known for his funny books today, for many in the know, he's also long been associated with horror comics, and Torres likes it that way. The story of Angelo Torres' EC work is a sad but rather interesting one, and also quickly explains why even the most devout fans of the EC horror line might be completely unfamiliar with his name. Starting sometime in 1952, Angelo Torres spent a few years doing uncredited ancillary work for EC, working his way dutifully up the ladder. After a year or two of uncredited grunt work, as was customary at the time, Torres managed to score a sparse amount of inking jobs for the Wounded Company throughout 1954 as they absolutely hemorrhaged money and titles following the witch hunt-styled persecution of the Senate Subcommittee hearing on juvenile delinquency and the resulting formation of the Comics Code Authority. While the work was drying up, Torres was one of the few artists that stuck around for EC's last gasp, the Picto-Fiction line. EC hoped that by publishing a magazine and not a comic, thereby circumventing the need to submit stories for approval by the Comics Code Authority or bear their seal of approval, that they could revitalize sales as the company hurtled towards inevitable financial collapse. After nearly 3 years of mostly uncredited work during the tail end of 1955, as problems with the Comics Code Authority were coming to a climactic head, EC finally gave Torres his first ever solo work, a story titled Eye for an Eye, slated for print in Incredible Science Fiction 33, cover dated January of 1956. However, the Comics Code wouldn't approve the story, and the story had to be replaced. As it happened, publisher William Gaines decided to run a reprint of an older story, Judgment Day. Judgment Day is not only one of the best stories that EC ever ran, but it has literally nothing objectionable in it. There's no violence, no sex, no nothing. It's a good old-fashioned morality tale. Unfortunately, it's a morality tale about racism. This did not sit well with the so-called comic czar, Judge Murphy, the head of the Comics Code Authority. While it's clear to anyone with a brain in their head that the Comics Code was simply a way of putting EC out of business without having to violate the law to do so, perhaps no other story typifies this truth more than that of the aptly titled Judgment Day. In the story, an astronaut visits a planet of sentient robots to see if they're advanced enough civilization-wise to join a galactic republic. The planet is split into two different factions of robots, one orange, the other blue, but both with the same functional capacity, with one being given less rights and viewed as inferior because of their color. After checking out the planet, the astronaut decides that because of this bigotry, the planet is not yet ready to join the Galactic Republic. This was revolutionary comic work, but the end of the story is what actually enraged Judge Murphy the most, apparently. After deciding that the planet isn't ready to join the Republic just yet, the astronaut boards his ship and removes his helmet to reveal he's an African American. Judge Murphy wasn't having it. No one was going to make people confront the ugly, harsh realities of the world that they lived in under his watch. No, sir. Murphy absolutely refused to put the Comics Code seal on the book, despite the fact that it had broken none of the code's absolutely infuriating list of rules, quite literally designed to put EC Comics out of business. Murphy insisted that the astronaut be completely removed from the story and refused to put the CCA stamp on it otherwise. Enraged, Al Feldstein personally argued with Judge Murphy, lobbying to get the story approved with no success. Following his unsuccessful attempt, Feldstein reported back to William Gaines about what had gone down. What happened next can quite literally only be defined as the shit hitting the fan. When Feldstein told Gaines, who is legendary for his even temper and rather jovial personality, that Judge Murphy was refusing to approve Judgment Day because of the color of the astronaut's skin, Gaines was furious. He'd had enough, and this was going to be where he made his last stand. They hadn't violated a single one of the code's asinine list of rules, and Gaines was going to be damned if some racist troglodyte pushed his own xenophobic agenda with his books. Apparently, William Gaines personally called up Judge Murphy and demanded that they grant the book the Comics Code seal, and repeatedly asked what exactly it was that he objected to. At one point, Gaines told Murphy that if he wasn't given a legitimate reason, he would not only sue the code and everyone involved, but that he was personally going to hold a press conference and tell people all about why Judgment Day wasn't allowed to see print. Eventually, and what appears to have been what Judge Murphy thought was a compromise enough to make Gaines happy, he finally agreed to publish the story with the black astronaut, if and only if they removed the beads of sweat on the man's head at the end of the story. After nearly 2 years of public persecution, as well as personal and professional embarrassments meted out by the code and those involved, William Gaines reached his breaking point. The kindly, well-spoken Gaines, along with L. Feldstein, who was sitting in for the telephone conversation at the time, screamed "F*** you" as their response. Murphy hung up, but Judgment Day ran in its original form and bore the Comics Code seal. It also happened to be the last comic that EC ever put out. The experience had not only taken the publisher's relationship with the head of the Comics Code to and beyond the breaking point, but it reaffirmed the feeling Gaines and many others involved that EC was simply being targeted, and the aim of the code wasn't so much to actually govern the content of the books, so much as it was to simply put them out of business and drag their name through the mud as much as possible. They shifted focus to the Picto fiction line, but those titles did not last long, and when EC's national distributor went bankrupt a few months later, Gaines canceled all of his titles except for Mad, never to return to the comic industry again. What should have been Angelo Torres' big breakout story for EC actually proved to be the very story that instigated the actual death of the publisher. As a result, Torres' EC debut ended up sitting in publication limbo for a remarkably long time. While Eye for an Eye was published in 1971, most sources fail to name the publication it could be found in for good reason. The EC library in the 1950s, Volume 9, was the first place that you could get Eye for an Eye, but unfortunately, it was from a small publisher named Nostalgia Press, and to my knowledge, was only available as a fairly pricey hardcover collection when it was released to a somewhat niche audience initially anyway. With an introduction by the Bob Stewart, yes, that Bob Stewart, and from what I understand, direct involvement and input from William Gaines, Horror Comics of the 1950s, as the cover proclaims, is one of the most impressive collections of EC material even today. The book was cost prohibitive even when it was released, though, and copies usually sell for a few $100 today in 2021. They've never been easy to get. For all intents and purposes, to the public at large, Eye for an Eye didn't sit for 15 years. It sat for an astounding 39 years. After almost 4 decades in publication purgatory, Eye for an Eye was finally restored and reinserted into the incredible science fiction issue it was originally slated to be a part of by Jim Stone in 1995. If you're looking to pick that issue up, put on your crazy cap, because this gets confusing as all get out. Jim Stone didn't retain the numbering of the original EC publications, which often picked up when one title was canceled. In the 1940s and 50s, many publishers, EC included, would simply change the name of a title, starting an entirely new series, but retaining the numbering from another. That's why there's no Tales from the Crypt #1. While there's no concrete evidence as to exactly why this was such common practice to begin with, a lot of people, myself included, think that it was probably because prior to the collector's boom that occurred in the 1970s and 80s, first issues didn't sell nearly as well as proven titles that had been around. The numbering was most likely emulating pulp magazines of the day, which were some of the only comparable publications, and also utilized ongoing numbering simply to keep track of what they were working on from a publisher's standpoint. However, it probably also tricked unsuspecting retailers into thinking certain titles had been around a lot longer than they really had, and thus implying there was a pre-existing audience who was already buying the title. The decision to change the numbering by Jim Stone when it came to their EC reprints, however, did not help and only served to further muddy the waters. Because of the way they did stuff, you couldn't go and pick up your Overstreet and look up issue 33 of Incredible Science Fiction and then go out and pick up that corresponding Jim Stone reprint issue from your LCS. Oh no! You had to know the stories and the cover so that you could check the issue of any given title you were actually buying to know which issue you were actually getting. In a time before the internet, this was beyond a headache. So, to make things simple, if you want to read the last comic EC ever put out as it was originally intended to be printed, you're looking for the Jim Stone Incredible Science Fiction issue 11 from 1995. I told you it was confusing. If that horror show of a story isn't enough to prove his horror credentials, Angelo Torres also did a number of stories for the Warren horror titles, Eerie and Creepy, which were essentially the spiritual successors to the old EC books. The Warren books, while not as commercially successful as EC's, were incredibly influential in their own right, and not only almost single-handedly spawned an entire generation of revolutionary and groundbreaking fantasy and horror artists like Frank Bruner, Mike Klug, Catherine Jeffrey Jones, Bernie Wrightson, and Mike Kaluta, but also helped to expose expose a completely new era of comics readers to seminal Golden Age artists like Frank Frazetta, who did an incredible amount of work for Warren as well. Since their publication in the 1960s, eerie and creepy especially have continued to grow in popularity as generation after generation of readers discover them, and they've become truly legendary in their own right. Despite the fact that he worked on a number of stories and for a number of the most seminal horror titles and publishers in comics history, because of his inordinate amount of work for Mad in particular, Angelo Torres isn't always a name that people associate with horror, but I think these tidbits show he more than qualified as original EC talent, at least in my opinion. I mean, Torres was the guy who helped expose what a bigoted piece of crap Judge Murphy really was, even if by happenstance, and just how much of a witch hunt the Code was by other publishers trying to put EC out of business. Unfortunately, all of this is in historical retrospect only and was completely unknown to those who experienced this contemporaneously. As for the actual story itself, A Quick Way to a Crusty Death is kind of interesting for a few reasons. While every other issue of Treehouse of Horror was composed of completely self-contained stories, the entire EC half of this issue actually logically transforms from one story to the next as part of their actual plot. Upon entering the creepy crypt of the haunted hotel, Lisa and Bart run into Krusty, who's working at Itchy and Scratchy Land as a vampire. As is often the case with the cartoon, Lisa notices something is off, and it turns out that while he isn't a vampire, Krusty is in fact a ghoul intent on eating the children. Ned Flanders shows up and is dressed as an obvious nod to the crypt keeper himself, and when Lisa asks him what he's doing there, he tells her that he's turned to the dark arts in hopes of bringing his wife Maud back from the dead with an incantation from one of the books in the library. Though obsessed with bringing back his dead wife, Flanders is still as helpful as ever and not only tells Lisa how to kill Krusty, but also arms her as well. I like the obvious nods to all these classic characters, and it was interesting to see that oftentimes Bongo kept up with continuity like Maud Flanders' death on the show, and that did sometimes actually manage to work in their favor. Having Ned Flanders just randomly show up in this evil library would have made no sense, but unfortunately the credits on this issue are a little spotty. I would hazard a guess that Morrison provided the stories and that Chris Bonham and Steve Ringenberg had only written the opening tale. However, there's no real writer credited in the rather strangely designed single-page credits. While it is possible that Bonham and Ringenberg were actually the two responsible for writing the stories for the EC guys they'd managed to get, I don't quite buy that. As hands-on and knowing how hard Morrison had to work to even make this insane issue possible, I'm willing to bet that he's the guy responsible. Again though, the credit page is extraordinarily weird looking, and for this half of the book, and Morrison is only officially mentioned as the editor on the book, receiving 0 writing credits for any of the stories. What I do know is that Angelo Torres, who is roughly 73 years old at the time he provided art for A Quick Way to a Crusty Death, definitely did not write this story. While it does fit his style of comedy rather shockingly well, I don't think a 73-year-old guy is keeping up with the Simpsons television show to hit on something like Maud's death, which while it had occurred some 5 years prior, was still something you had to be watching new episodes to really pick up on. Then again, he did agree to do the issue, so maybe I'm just being an ageist. Torres spent decades working with pop culture phenomenon throughout his time on Mad, so who knows? While prolific as all get out, Angelo Torres isn't a household name. The incomparable John Severin, on the other hand, most definitely is. Severin follows Torres' story with back-to-back tales, each representing a different era and genre from his work for EC. The first is a 40s era war story spoof Bart Simpson's Midget Commando. While obviously short and sweet given its limited page count, Midget Commando showcases so many of the things that made Severin a revolutionary and highly sought-after illustrator. It's incredible. Severin came up doing work for a number of publishers, including Timely Atlas, who would become Marvel and DC. Severin apparently just kind of fell into comics after renting space from high school friend turned comic pro himself, Bill Elder, and his studio mate at the time, Harvey Kurtzman. Intrigued by the easy money that Kurtzman was making in between other graphic design jobs, Severin got into the business starting in 1947. He quickly became well respected among his peers for a few things, but his ability to draw people of different nationalities in a realistic and highly accurate fashion set him apart from nearly all of his contemporaries. While he initially rose to prominence at EC for his work on their war stories, much like Harvey Kurtzman actually, Severin would go on to be just as synonymous, if not more so, with cartoon and comedy work. The composition and energy of the story are ridiculously well done. This is likely because Severin had a lot of practice working with this kind of parody material, appearing in 9 out of the 10 original issues of Mad before then going on to also work for Cracked as well. This work was also often highly constrained by page counts, so Severin was certainly accustomed to extremely short stories, and both his stories for this issue exemplify his incredible ability to tell complete and interesting and funny stories, even given these limitations. His second story, Shock, Suspense, Simpsons, is a commentary on the 1950s comic book witch hunt that led to the Senate subcommittee hearing on juvenile delinquency and ultimately the Comics Code Authority, which effectively put EC out of business, as I've mentioned a few times. Shock, Suspense, Simpsons isn't nearly as energetic and frantic a story as Midget Commando, but it does a wonderful job of showcasing and reminding people John Severin was just as adept at creating parody and comedy as he was hard-hitting war stories and big action pieces. Again, this feels like Bill Morrison really showing off his knowledge of who he's working with and what they've done, choosing not to just showcase Severin's war stuff or his Mad work, but paying both equal homage. He absolutely knocks the ball out of the park on Midget Commando, but the fantastic amount of cameos and characters that he's able to squeeze into the 5-page Shock, Suspense, Simpsons, I mean, his obvious knowledge of the events that took place and his ability to distill and analyze that era into a few simple pages make Shock, Suspense stories a real pleasure to read. What makes Shock, Suspense, Simpsons my favorite of Severin's contributions here is the story, though. Mayor Quimby is censoring comics and being chased by this angry mob, and it turns out that the real reason he's putting all these publishers out of business is because he has his own comic company. Quimby and his associates label anyone who doesn't see the corrupting influence of books from any other publisher as either communist or un-American, and at one point, they actually dress up in white Ku Klux Klan-style outfits and attend a comic burning. While a lot of people know about the Comics Code Authority peripherally, this 5-page story does more to tell the truths of what was going on behind the scenes than I would care to admit. Whoever wrote this, as again, I'm not sure if this was Morrison or Morrison with Severin or Chris Bonham or what, but whoever wrote this absolutely killed it with this one. As the problems Judgment Day faced from the code should make all too clear, everything from the Klan outfits to the comic burnings are far too real and intrinsically tied to why I actually started this channel. Shock, Suspense, Simpsons is one of the best stories that Bongo ever published and a difficult act to come after, but following on the theme of each story directly leading into one another from the first panels of Blast from the Past, it's apparent that they've saved the best for last, as it were. Incredible to look at, even from the start, you know you're in for something really special, and Blast from the Past is actually one of 2 stories that make this actually historically significant as a comic book issue to me. There's a few things that make Blast from the Past important, but the least of which certainly is not that the pencils were done by the insanely talented Mark Schultz of Xenozoic Tales, aka Cadillacs and Dinosaurs fame, and inks were credited to none other than the legendary Al Williamson himself, something of a miracle in itself given that he'd completely retired from the industry 3 years prior to issue 11 of Treehouse of Horror in 2002. Schultz was an enormous Williamson fan, claiming he owed much of his style to Williamson's influence in numerous interviews over the years, and Schultz had in fact been trying to make a number of joint projects between the two work for almost 20 years with extremely limited success for a host of different reasons. There aren't a lot of firsts in Williamson's and Schultz's collaborations, but there are unfortunately a lot of lasts. Originally in 1987, Williamson suggested he draw a story for Schultz's absolutely mind-bending black and white Xenozoic Tales series, better known these days as Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. Unfortunately though, Williamson only managed to get so far as partially inking 4 pages before he finally called the whole thing off, stating he was just too busy. He did partially complete 4 pages though, and if you want to see the pages for that proposed story, Isolation, incredibly, they were actually collected for the Al Williamson Archives Volume 1 by Flesk back in 2010. Schultz and Williamson continued to try and work together on numerous occasions over the following years, but stuff just never seemed to pan out the way it was supposed to. Schultz wasn't lying when he said he was a massive Williamson fan, and he even wrote and released Hidden Lands, a biography about Al Williamson, through Dark Horse Comics in 2004, a year before this issue happened. While basically every one of their collaborations went down in flames before they were ever even completed, in 1995 they did finally manage to get the 2-issue Flash Gordon miniseries from Marvel out. The mini featured Mark Schultz tackling writing duties with Al Williamson doing his last published work that I know of, where he contributed both pencils and inks for a major publisher before he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease only a few months later. Weirdly enough, the last thing that they worked on together was a story published in the Namor the Submariner's 70th anniversary special in 2009. The thing was, Al Williamson had drawn the story some 30 years prior, and Mark Schultz wrote the story and dialogue around the existing art right around the time of Williamson's unfortunate passing. After years of suffering the ravaging effects of the debilitating disease, Blast from the Future Past would prove to be Al Williamson's final published professional work before his death in 2010. In fact, while Bongo and Morrison were understandably excited about getting Al Williamson at the time, according to interviews, the reality of the situation was anything but optimal. Williamson was in such rough shape by the time that he was working on the inks for Blast from the Future Past that, according to Morrison, he thought Schultz ended up having to, quote, help Al out on that story because Al was really in the throes of Alzheimer's. Some people might think that such a storied career as that of Al Williamson coming to such an abrupt halt in the pages of a Simpsons comic is a sad and woeful thing. Personally, I do not. All things considered, it might have actually been rather fortuitous. Not only was it nice that after so many years of trying to collaborate on something together, Schultz was able to do a story where he helped with the art side, but it's also obvious that Bill Morrison and basically everyone involved with this issue respected and even revered the EC talent that they were working with. While they are parody stories, there's nothing mean-spirited or derogatory about them or the way that they depict EC. The source material is in fact treated with a rather inordinate amount of reverence, considering this is parody material meant to poke fun. Throughout the issue, there's some really cool nods to EC, and especially their cast of ghoulish hosts like the Crypt Keeper and the Old Witch. The image which ends this story, though, a homage to perhaps Williamson's best work and one of the single greatest images ever created for comics in general for that matter, is nearly perfect. Growing up, I read a ton of EC reprints, and one of Williamson's most famous tales, The Aliens, always captivated me. It was itself a fairly tongue-in-cheek look at the destructive path that the world seemed to be careening down at the time of its original publication in February of 1953. While the terms Squatron and Spafam, which first appeared in The Aliens, would go on to become mainstays of the comic book lexicon, inspiring absolutely stellar fanzine publications of the same names, the best part of The Aliens is that final infinite regression panel. In the story, this group of aliens discover a comic book which is telling the story that they are in. Eventually, they open the comic up to read it, and The Aliens ends with one of the most incredible infinite regression panels I have ever seen. Not only has this image gone on to become one of the most singularly recognizable comic book illustrations in history, but it's without a doubt the most recognizable image that Williamson crafted during his more than half-century of invaluable contributions to the industry. It's one of the few images that transcended its comic book origins, and it has been the subject of more homages and swiped more times than any other single image in comic book history, perhaps. And that's saying something. Because of this, it seemed only fitting that in the last pages of the final story that Al Williamson ever worked on, his most revered image is once again lovingly recreated to end Blast from the Future Past. Williamson was always looking forward, always working, always evolving as an artist, and it was nice for him to end on such a high note, looking back so fondly and lovingly on one of his most beloved and imitated works. Blast from the Future Past reads like a love letter to Al Williamson and the entire EC era of horror and sci-fi in general. It would have been enough to seal the deal and make this a must-own comic for me personally on its own, but that's only half the book. When I picked up this issue, I honestly didn't pay much attention to anything other than the fact that it had Mark Schultz's name alongside Al Williamson and other EC talent. I was sold then and there. After devouring the first half of this issue, though, I kind of remembered there was a second half. There was even more. But even knowing what I knew going into reading it about the postcode horror teams, I just kept thinking, there's no way the second half of this comic could possibly manage to live up to the EC side. I mean, they had Al Williamson and Mark Schultz on the same story. John Severin had done not one, but two stories, and someone finally acknowledged Angelo Torres and the work he did for the EC horror titles. Even as a kid, I remember reading about Eye for an Eye and thinking how cool it was that it had finally seen publication after so many years when I found it inside of one of those gemstone reprints. Plus, I always loved the stories that he did for Warren, so just seeing his name definitely put a smile on my face. Angelo Torres seriously is a deep dive, and I was completely unconvinced Morrison could offer anything up to compete. As it turns out, I was in for one heck of a surprise. The flip side of issue 11 pays homage to the Marvel and DC horror titles that limped on in rather castrated fashions due to the interference of the Comics Code Authority after the death of EC's horror titles and the failure of their black and white horror magazines by both EC as well as Marvel and DC, who were trying to imitate Warren and their ilk. During the 1970s, fantasy, sword, and sorcery, along with monster and horror titles in general, experienced a resurgence in popularity, and Marvel and DC weren't going to miss the boat. Marvel quickly launched some really great titles like Savage Sword of Conan, and DC began their House of Secrets and House of Mystery titles in earnest once more. Honestly, though, a lot of their stuff is just plain crap. For the most part, it was all hokey, non-threatening monsters featuring in badly contrived stories with even more hackneyed dialogue. Again, though, Bill Morrison knows his stuff, and it shows. Hidden among those atrocious titles, there were some absolutely gorgeous artwork, namely for DC by several Warren alumni such as Bernie Wrightson and Mike Cluda, as well as some rather interesting takes on the monster and horror genres such as Tomb of Dracula by Gene Colan and Marv Wolfman, which somehow successfully amalgamated monster and superhero comics in an extraordinarily rare victory, producing the breakout character Blade for the 10th issue in June of 1973. These were the names that Morrison had been hunting, and somehow all of them had agreed to work on this issue of Treehouse of Horror. Truly an enviable cast of some of the best names in post-code horror, without question. Of the few names that stand out as having done anything interesting or significant in these latter-day horror titles, Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan are among the titans and almost certainly some of the first names that come to mind for most people. While Blade was a fairly niche character for a long time with 3 highly successful films under his trench coat and his supposed reboot on the way, he's definitely transcended any sort of cult-level status that he once had, becoming an honorary Marvel heavy hitter. At the box office anyway. Unfortunately, the comics have never really enjoyed the same amount of success, and the only real Blade stuff that most people seek out are the original Gene Colan Marv Wolfman stories. Bonus fact, when Gene Colan and Marv Wolfman returned to Tomb of Dracula in the early 1990s, they were joined by none other than Al Williamson on inks for the series. Both Colan and Wolfman enjoyed long and extremely successful lives in the industry far beyond Blade, and I honestly don't know what's more impressive. The fact that Bill Morrison got them to agree to work on a parody Simpsons comic, or the fact that he got them to agree to parody themselves in said book. In Sub-Basement of Dracula, they do just that though, liberally poking fun at their own seminal Tomb of Dracula run. By the time the Treehouse of Horror 11 was being put together in 2005, Gene Colan was 78 and his health had been in steady decline for several years, having battled cancer before then ultimately being diagnosed with liver disease, which slowly killed him over a number of years, laying absolute waste to his already battered body during the process. While it is obviously horrible that he had such a rough time, the way his physical ailments affected his work and his approach to his art is actually really interesting to see. Colan spent his entire life refining his craft, and there's an undeniable energy and excitement to the art even here years into his horrendous struggle with both cancer and liver disease. It's super loose, and you can tell by the art and the script. I think Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan were basically allowed to do whatever they wanted for 13 pages, and Gene Colan appears to just be having fun. The explosive nature and sheer dynamism almost remind me of Kirby at some points, and if you look at the art, I think that Colan actually scanned in his pencils and used them rather than traditionally inking his stuff for this. The credits say, quote, art provided by Gene Colan. They don't even mention inks, and I could be totally off, but either way, this story went a long way in proving that Gene Colan was far from done in the industry to me and a lot of other people. In fact, he was inducted into the Eisner Hall of Fame this same year in 2005 and would go on to win an Eisner Award in 2010 for the best single issue with writer Ed Brubaker for his work on Captain America 601 before his unfortunate passing on June 23rd of 2011, less than a year later and only 2 days after his beloved wife Adrienne on June 21st. There's a freedom and a power to Colan's work that he did in these last few years especially, which really showcase how much of a master craftsman he was and a wonderful legacy for later generations were left to remember him by. And surprisingly enough, Treehouse of Horror is definitely one of those later greater works. The art for Sub-Basement of Dracula is incredibly interesting, but this isn't to leave the ever-clever Marv Wolfman out of the picture. In Sub-Basement of Dracula, Wolfman uses the story as a way to absolutely rip on the comics industry and really takes advantage of the fact that Bongo did not seem to exist as a way to strip creators of their original characters and drain them of creativity like most of the major publishers do. The idea is, instead of regular vampires who are out to suck everyone's blood, there are succubus-like comic book publishers who feed on creativity and originality instead. The twist is that these comic book creators offer themselves up as willing victims, and once the publishers have completely sucked the creators dry of all their creativity and originality, they're then finally allowed to work on their favorite mainstream superhero titles. The message is not difficult to ascertain, and Wolfman definitely wasn't pulling any punches, though it does feel like it's being done for fun rather than coming off as an angry rant from a disenfranchised ex-player or anything. Everything about the story is well done in my opinion, and while Sub-Basement of Dracula isn't going to win any awards, it is fun and it did a good job of living up to the impeccably high expectations created by the EC Precode horror of issue 11, which in and of itself is impressive. What followed, however, is what I personally consider the high watermark for this truly amazing title, a work that truly transcends its roots as a Simpsons story and, like Blast from the Future Past, is of actual historical importance. Squish Thing is just what it sounds like, a parody of Swamp Thing. This in and of itself is nothing special. Parodies and slightly differing versions of swamp creatures have always been strangely found all over the place. What is special is that decades after their groundbreaking work together on the original Swamp Thing title, creators LEN WEIN and Wrightson finally agreed to return to their muck-encrusted creation one final time. At least sort of. I mean, this is a Simpsons comic we're talking about, so you're not going to get the next chapter in Alec Holland's life or anything. The fact we got anything having to do with Swamp Thing out of Wrightson, especially at this point, is almost nothing short of astounding, though. While Wrightson is one of the most legendary illustrators in the field, he's also well known for his art undergoing a drastic change in quality almost overnight. While I've heard differing reasons for this over the years, including from Wrightson himself, who acknowledged this drastic change numerous times, I think what actually happened is that Wrightson injured his wrist sometime during the 1980s. Some people claim this was due to his overworking himself on his insane Frankenstein illustrations. I've never bought this, though. Wrightson made several allusions to some sort of sprain or break that occurred in the 80s, from what I can tell, and for whatever reason, after the injury, he had to learn how to hold a drawing utensil completely differently. Just like Frank Frazetta, there was no stopping this man. He was no longer able to hold a drawing utensil straight up and down like you or I would without considerable discomfort, and instead changed up his grip on the instrument almost entirely to what would mostly be used for gesturing by most artists. This essentially meant he had to learn how to draw all over again in a lot of ways. Wrightson spent a few years trying to get back to that extremely detailed, high contrast pen and ink work that he was so well known for, but try as he might, his art looked different after his wrist injury in the 1980s. He did increasingly less work for the comics field during the latter part of the 80s, instead enjoying no small amount of success in Hollywood as a storyboard artist, also creating characters and background designs for some of the most iconic films of the decade, including Ghostbusters, for which he contributed a number of iconic designs. He'd spent almost 7 years creating some of the most highly respected, sought-after, and expensive pieces of comic book art in history to accompany a new printing of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus from Marvel. And while the work was exquisite, it burnt him out in a few ways, and when he discovered that you could make as much for drawing a simple storyboard that no one outside of a production office was ever going to see in a few weeks, as he had in the past decade working for the biggest publishers in comics, Wrightson began to get more and more involved with commercial illustrations of all sorts. Like his contemporary Mike Ploog, some of Wrightson's best illustrations from the latter part of his career may never be seen again because of the way the production art and design work for major studios. There's been a few books compiling his storyboards specifically, but a lot of his character and background design work is probably lost forever at this point, unfortunately. That being said, after a certain point, Bernie Wrightson's work felt like a shadow of what it had been in a lot of ways. While much of his later work is somewhat disappointing when you're used to his earlier material for Swamp Thing, Warren, and a lot of those amazing DC horror covers, Squish Thing is without a doubt one of the best things that Wrightson ever did in his entire career. The art easily elevates itself above simple parody work with the luscious line work and gorgeous usage of shadow. While it's absolutely insane to look at, unfortunately, it seems like very few people are even aware of the story's existence. I have to admit, I am a massive Bernie Wrightson fan, and I own about 90% of everything he ever released. I spent the better part of the last 3 decades collecting his stuff, and I didn't even know this story existed until I unsuspectingly flipped issue 11 of Treehouse of Horror over and started reading. Attesting to how little attention this story gets, Heritage Auctions sold the entire 15-page story in 2013 for an incredible $7,100. Comparatively, the cheapest original art you see coming up from Wrightson, especially having to do with horror and specifically Swamp Thing, will run you just shy of 20 grand a page. And honestly, for $7,000, I might have actually made a play at this. I mean, who needs your kidney when you can own original Bernie Wrightson art? And as another historical side note, because I'm completely OCD psycho when it comes to this kind of stuff, Heritage also sold what they described as an unused Bernie Wrightson cover for Treehouse of Horror in 2018. The black and white 10x15 fully inked piece of Homer in this same Squish Thing setting sold around $5,500. While again, totally underpriced, what's interesting here is that Heritage was actually incorrect about the origins of the illustration. When I saw it, I wondered how the heck Bill Morrison wound up not using it. The piece is absolutely amazing, with Marge in place as the original Louise Simonson model from the iconic first appearance of Swamp Thing in House of Secrets 92 and featuring Homer as Squish Thing. Turns out they didn't decide not to use it. I eventually found an interview where Bill Morrison actually sets this fact straight while lamenting the fact they weren't the ones who came up with the idea. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who found Squish Thing to be one of Wrightson's most inspired pieces, and the aforementioned cover was in fact a commission from a fan following the book's release. While Wrightson might not have been capable of rendering the highly detailed and inordinately intricate designs of his youth at this point, his ability to add deceptively effective lighting schemes and impeccable line work are extenuated by the eerily on-model characters here utilized to great effect. Wrightson does an incredible job of blending his signature style of realistic cartoon anatomy with matte graining overbites and the bulbous proportions of the Simpsons universe. Wrightson, just like Sam Keith, has long long spoken about how he had to learn the human anatomy so that he could learn to break it. Beneath every impossibly contorted and cartoonish illustration he did is the skeleton of a functional figure. There was something ethereal and terrifying about his figure work because of this, and the results of applying this to The Simpsons is nothing short of astounding. Admittedly, I'm a huge Wrightson fan anyway, but Squish Thing is something special in my opinion. Wrightson rarely returned to Swamp Thing over the years. While he liked Alan Moore's Swamp Thing for what it was, a clever and inventive book that was one of the best contemporary horror publications in the industry, from what I understand, Wrightson never really got over the dramatic changes that happened to his character, namely that of Alec Holland in Swamp Thing, where he wasn't actually Alec Holland, but a sentient plant that believed he was Alec Holland. He was never one to do an inordinate amount of commissions, given how long it took him to complete them and how busy he stayed with pretty high-profile work for films that included The Faculty, Galaxy Quest, Spider-Man, The Mist, Land of the Dead, and Serenity throughout even the tail end of his career. While Wrightson hadn't drawn Swamp Thing in years, you couldn't tell by looking at Squish Thing. It actually looks like prime-time Wrightson, which is nothing short of awesome. And for me, finding a new Swamp Thing story by Bernie Wrightson was pretty freaking amazing. Add to that the fact Len Wein was there writing dialogue and providing the script, and you've got a recipe for a real treat. Squish Thing basically retells the Alec Holland Swamp Thing origin from Wrightson and Wein's debut Swamp Thing work back in the 1970s, except that Moe is Arcane and Homer is Alec Holland, becoming the titular Squish monster in this version. The printed color version of the story is absolutely amazing, but one of the coolest things about Squish Thing is that because the original art was sold by Heritage as part of an online auction, you can look at extremely high-resolution scans of every page on their website. It really is something to behold, honestly, with the lush pen and work brush work of Wrightson just as vibrant and powerful as they were during his heyday in the 1970s. I don't want to oversell it too much. Like I said, it is only a 15-page parody story for a Simpsons comic, but the fact that Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson got back together to work on Swamp Thing, at least in a way before Wrightson's unfortunate passing, is really cool to me. Sadly, Wrightson had completed the script for what was going to be a new ongoing Swamp Thing series prior to his death in 2017, but had grown far too sick to work on it following a horrific battle with brain cancer. After a series of what I believe were mini strokes, Wrightson retired officially from comics in January of 2017 and passed away less than 4 months later in March of that same year, having never finished a single issue of art for the proposed Swamp Thing relaunch and leaving an inexorable hole in my life. The script was published as part of the Swamp Thing Winter Special #1 in February of 2018, though, and DC did the release right. They included both the original script as well as an illustrated version with art by Kelley Jones. For all intents and purposes, though, Squish Thing was the last Swamp Thing material that Wrightson ever did, and Len Wein contributed scripts, making it all the more unbelievable it was done for a Simpsons comic. The art for Squish Thing features the usual luscious pen and ink work by Wrightson, but the colors by longtime Bongo staffer Chris Unger complement stuff so well I was beyond impressed. This is just another point where you have to concede the absolutely stellar level of talent that Bongo was bringing to the table and the exactingly high standards to which they held themselves. If you can successfully color Bernie Wrightson, you're definitely doing something right, in my opinion. While Unger has a number of credits for Bongo, interestingly, most of them were for his roles as a letterer starting around 1995, production manager starting in this same year of 2005, and Unger would actually continue to work with Bongo until they shut their doors, impressively managing to work himself all the way up to editor-in-chief in 2017. His work on Squish Thing is probably the biggest thing he ever tackled, though, and he did not disappoint. Wrightson's heavy use of blacks is always omnipresent in his work, but for this story, which takes place almost entirely at night, it's even more so, and even darker than a lot of his other stuff. It would have been really easy to lose the fine lines and details of his work with too dark a color palette, or likewise completely blow out the image with colors that were too bright. Fortunately for everyone involved, Unger's work is pretty impeccable. His use of the trademark Simpsons yellow for people's skin is nearly perfect, and he actually washed out the colors for a lot of the brighter stuff throughout to give it a more naturalistic feel, which really suits the story well. The scene of Bart and Homer running into each other would have been really easy to overdo with the neon greens and yellows, but even Bart's shirt and the usual almost glowing orange-brown from Moe's Tavern are washed out just ever so slightly. Without this subtle touch, I think a lot of the more nuanced pieces of Wrightson's work would have either disappeared into the shadows or simply been swallowed up in the painfully incandescent colors of the Simpsons universe. Instead, Wrightson crafts a deeply moody tale, casting many of Springfield's most famous denizens in pastiches and scenes from some of his most successful horror work. The panels of Moe's Tavern with the shadow of the trees from across the street are some of my favorite Wrightson panels ever. The sheer perfection of the perspective is undeniable. I also love the panels of Moe when he breaks into the house and is threatening Marge with a knife. He is always played up as this super creepy guy on the show, this lecherous sleazebag, but he's never looked like such a monster as he does here, or as scary. The way the shadows envelop his face, making him look like an actual psychopath, and when Homer breaks through the window, making his big entrance as Squish Thing, you can look back at Wrightson's work on Swamp Thing, and it's pretty incredible just how close he gets to approximating the intensity and the power of those original images in this work for Treehouse of Horror. In Squish Thing, Homer is carrying a beer and runs into Bart, who has a squishy in his hands. Obviously, the two mix, and Homer decides that he's going to make more of the delicious concoction on his own in his garage at home. Moe, of course, oversees everything and decides to put a time bomb in the garage and blow up Homer, claiming the drink for himself to sell at his bar. Homer is caught in the explosion and, like Alec Holland, goes running for the nearest water. Unlike Holland, who extinguished himself in the swamp, though, a swimming pool of his new drink is the nearest thing, and Homer plunges into a concoction of beer and squishy, seeming to die. When he comes out, he's more squishy than man. Maybe the most impressive part of this story is how well LEN WEIN adapts his narration to fit The Simpsons, though. He manages to make callbacks to nearly every one of the best and most memorable lines from Swamp Thing without it feeling contrived or forced. In turn, Wrightson is so convincingly able to combine Homer with Swamp Thing that some of the panels look like they could literally be from an unused issue. It's not just that this looks or even reads like an old Swamp Thing book that's the best thing to me, though. What makes this really special is the perfect amalgamation of new and old that it manages to strike, combining two halves to make an entirely new whole that is greater than the sum of their parts. Everything about Squish Thing, from the writing to the art to the colors, is on point at all times. Even the lettering by John Costanzo looks perfect. I guess I might be overselling this piece a little bit, but it's very rare that I come across something like this that doesn't just work, or even just work well, but that I wouldn't change anything about. It's a wonderful parody, a perfect pastiche, and some of the best writing from Wein and art from Wrightson that you're likely to find in the latter part of their careers. Treehouse of Horror published other stories. They did other issues, but for me, this was the moment that Bill Morrison had envisioned when he began the series in 1995. He just hadn't known it at the time. Squish Thing and the rest of issue 11 represent a monumental undertaking, a massive achievement that deserved and still deserves a lot more recognition and adulation than it's likely to ever receive, unfortunately. This issue represents an unbelievable moment in comics where a simple parody book truly transcended genre and subject matter and contributed something important and lasting to the world of comic books, despite the fact that it's constantly marginalized just because of who published it. Bart Simpson's Treehouse of Horror continued on for another 12 issues and would go on to host an absolutely ridiculous list of talents before it was all said and done, with issue 23 in 2017. Issue 12 alone features Terry Moore, Kyle Baker, and Eric Powell, who won an Eisner Award for Best Short Comedy Story for his contribution, Willie, Portrait of a Groundskeeper. There really is some truly insane stuff in the next 11 issues, including the Gene Haas story Nosferatu, A Simpsony of Horror, in issue 17, 13, which is a personal favorite of mine. Following issue 11, some of the stories are great and the art is even better, but the TLC that really set issues 5 through 11 apart from nearly anything else being published at the time just wasn't nearly as omnipresent. They continued to feature big industry names for a while, but even that became more sporadic at a certain point. And by issue 20, Bart Simpson's Treehouse of Horror, simply titled Treehouse of Horror by that point, was back to where it began in many ways, with one major exception, that is. A growing number of regular Bongo staffers were again working on the book, but this time they were given the same chance to work outside of the strict model demands of the rest of Bongo's publications as the major industry talent had been. While a great number of these artists are somewhat unremarkable, there are two major exceptions, and they make picking up the later issues totally worth it. I'm not inordinately familiar with a lot of the Bongo staff, but I am going to tell you right now, Tone or Tony Rodriguez, I'm not sure which, and Bat and Lash absolutely murder every single story that they work on for Treehouse of Horror in the best ways. And that's a good thing because Rodriguez especially shows up a lot in later issues. His work never fails to impress, however, and I would always find myself flipping forward to his stuff to read it before the other stories when I was going through these later issues. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find an inordinate amount of details about exactly what Rodriguez has been working on, but according to a recent Facebook post, he's done more than 500 stories for comic books at this point. His Grand Comic Book database has a whopping 144 entries, which obviously doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of what he's done. The latest thing that I know of personally that Rodriguez is contributing to is the runaway hit Stray Dogs for Image, which he's doing layouts and backgrounds for. With how well that series is doing, I'm seriously surprised I couldn't find more out about him. So I can't say for sure what all of his to check out, but I can seriously recommend his Bongo work, which he did a fair amount of, and I know you can check out a lot of his stuff via Facebook and his Instagram pages if you're interested enough. His Radioactive Man and Treehouse of Horror contributions were enough to pique my interest, but learning he's laying out Stray Dogs has definitely got me interested in seeking out more of his work after this video. His work for Treehouse of Horror, which is featured in basically at least every other issue of this series moving forward, makes picking up the final 12 issues alone worth it in my opinion. Unfortunately, that brings us to actually getting this series though. While it's not widely known among most readers, collectors have apparently long been aware of it, and as a result of its quality as well as relative scarcity when compared to books by the likes of Marvel and DC on the secondary market, this series is not cheap. If you're looking for reader copies and you're willing to put in the footwork, you might be able to pick up most of these issues in mid to lower grades fairly cheap, but with 23 issues apiece commanding between $10 and $30 for higher end copies, I quickly went in search of trades for this episode. Unfortunately, like with many of their titles, the reprints of this series were handled atrociously by Bongo. There are pretty widely available trade paperbacks for a fair price on Amazon. I think maybe one of them is out of print, but it's not overly pricey even at that at this point. But sadly, these collections not only cut off at issue 16, none of them collect complete issues. They're instead split into stories, and many of the best stories from Treehouse of Horror have never been collected in any form or fashion that I'm aware of. Plus, issues 17 through 23 were never collected in any fashion at all before Bongo went bye-bye. So unfortunately, if you want to read the entire series like I did, you're kind of stuck picking up floppies on the secondhand market. It's not cheap, and honestly, it wasn't easy assembling a complete run, with some of the later issues being particularly difficult to pick up. But it is totally worth tracking down, in my opinion. I wish I had more time to delve into some of these later issues, but I figure 3-hour-long episodes is enough about a single series, no matter how good it is. I want to thank longtime viewer and supporter of the channel, Arendum Sen, for recommending that I check out this series. I very well might not have given this series a second thought otherwise, and boy would I have been missing out. So Thank you, Arendum. I hope you and everyone else who took the time to check this out enjoyed it, maybe even learned something. If you did like what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about sharing these videos with your friends. Get in the comments section below and let me know. And remember, if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind-the-scenes posts, updates, info, uncut interviews, merchandise discount codes, and you can even get your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel but Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. After 2 years of fighting with AdSense, you can now finally sign up for memberships right here on YouTube. So make sure you hit that little join button at the bottom of the screen and check out the different tiers for the perks that fit you best. There's also links to my Ko-Fi page where you can make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel, a link to my Amazon page where you can donate source material for research and upcoming episodes, and if that's not enough, there's even links to pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. I want to sincerely thank each and every single one of you that signed up for the Patreon page, membership here on YouTube, or donated material, money via Ko-Fi and equipment. It really means the world to me, and I could not do these episodes without your help. Speaking of which, this episode was brought to you, as always, by the Jerk Broadcasting System, as well as generous grants from the viewers that you see on the screen now. I'd also like to thank my loyal Wednesday Warriors, Mike Dolan, John Utley, David Arroyo, Super Chasen, and Mike Dolan again, as well as Weapon X Squall, David Arroyo, John Havarton, Thomas N. Perkins, and Alex Gaylor for their generous donations. You guys are amazing, and I don't even know what to say other than thank you, thank you, thank you. Speaking of which, thank you for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. Either way, as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.